let's talk about what we saw in the copper cycle lab. So we originally started with a test tube. And in that first test tube, we put this 1 pinky worth of this bright blue liquid. And that bright blue liquid was copper 2 nitrate. And it was clear, you could see through it, but it was this bright, pretty blue. And then in our first couple steps, what we added is we added some sodium hydroxide. We added about 2 pinkies worth of that. And we also added some distilled water from the squeeze bottle. And that's where we saw our first change. So once we added those 2 more liquids, we had quite a bit more in our test tube. And it was kind of this like brighter blue. And it also had this like jelly-like substance in it. And that jelly-like substance was actually a solid precipitate that formed. And that solid precipitate that formed in there was copper 2 hydroxide. And how that formed is we had a chemical reaction. And what we made in our product was we took this copper from our reactant and this hydroxide from our reactant, and we made copper 2 hydroxide. After we did those first couple steps, we then took that test tube and we put it in a hot water bath. So what we did is we added some heat. And that heat made our copper undergo another change. We left it in the water, the hot water, until we saw a big change. And that big change was that we formed this black substance that all settled at the bottom. And that black substance that settled at the bottom was copper 2 oxide. And we still had some clear liquid on the top at that point. So whenever we added heat, it turned our copper hydroxide into copper oxide. And there's still this clear liquid on the top where we have some other things still in there. So then we took our pipette and we pipetted off that liquid on the top. We washed it with some water in order to clear out that extra stuff so that hopefully after all the washing and the pipetting off of the liquid, we end up with, as much as we could, just this copper oxide. After it cooled and we washed, we then added hydrochloric acid for what is my favorite step because it's like the biggest change that we saw. So once we added that hydrochloric acid, we added enough hydrochloric acid until we saw a big change. And it was a big change because we had this solid copper oxide at the bottom and we added hydrochloric acid until the entire test tube was, instead of this solid black thing, it was now this pretty light blue, and it was a liquid, and it was so clear you could see through it. And what we made there was copper 2 chloride. So you can see here that we are still using the same copper from the previous step, and we bonded it with the chloride from our hydrochloric acid to form copper 2 chloride. And that's my favorite step because it's just such a big change. Then, to finish the lab, we added in a wire made of aluminum. And when we did that, we should have seen some more signs of a chemical reaction. So we hooked that wire over, and then we still had some liquid in there. And we didn't really wait long enough, but at the end of class, I showed you a test tube of what it would have looked like if we would have waited long enough. If we would have waited long enough, what we would have seen is we would have seen a clear liquid, and the clear liquid was aluminum chloride. And where the copper went was it was the copper that was sitting on the wire. So a lot of people on this step, I hear people say, oh, it's rust, but it's not rust. It's actually copper. And the copper came from here. That's how we formed this copper. We pulled it out of the solution. And now the solution is the aluminum from the wire and the chloride from the previous solution. Now, when we do this, because we still have from over here, we have some water. Here we have some hydrogen from our hydrochloric acid. We also, at this step, one of our signs is you should have seen these bubbles. And these bubbles are a sign that a gas was being made. And the bubbles were actually hydrogen gas being made. And that was the end of what we did in class. We should have ended up at the end with this hook inside a clear liquid with a whole bunch of copper on it. So question 2, it says, at each step in the copper cycle, explain what we noticed. So what were some signs of a chemical reaction as we went through? I think the most obvious thing that we can see is from like step 1, we had like a blue. Then in step 2, up here, test tube 2, we have a little bit different blue. And then it went black. And then it went light blue. Then it went clear. So I think the biggest thing that we see at several steps are color changes. We also, at a couple different times, had you feel the test tube. And why we had you feel the test tube is we also felt some temperature changes along the way. Another sign of a chemical reaction. Here in my second test tube that I drew, we formed this like jelly-like substance, which was actually a solid. And that solid is called a precipitate. And forming a precipitate is a sign of a chemical reaction. And last but not least, in this last one, when you put that aluminum wire in the copper chloride solution, you should have seen some fizzing or some bubbles, which is a sign that we're producing a gas. Now, question number 3, it says if we add nitric acid, HNO3, right, because the ic comes from 8, so it's nitrate. What makes it an acid is this hydrogen on the front, would create copper 2 nitrate, which is actually what we started with. So if we added nitric acid, it would create back to our beginning. And this is why it's called the copper cycle lab. So we're going to add this to our drawing here. So what we can do is we can just swing this around back here. And if we would have added nitric acid, we would then make copper 2 nitrate, which is where we started. But we don't do this step because it also makes a poisonous gas. And that's numbers 1 through 3 of your copper cycle lab. So what I want you to work on now by yourself is number 4 and 5 before you turn in the lab.